Stephen Lopez was convicted for abusing and killing his 5-month-old niece Brianna Lopez. The correctional department says that, due to the nature of the charges, his life could be in danger, so they are working with other prisons to transfer him.
His case was known as Baby Brianna, a tiny little girl of just 5 months born right in the middle of hell, surrounded by monsters, abusers, and bullies. Her uncle Stephen Lopez was one of the culprits, as this sadist was joined by her own parents, as well as the people who chose to remain silent, even knowing the baby's suffering. Given the nature of the acts, this story became one of the worst cases of child abuse in New Mexico and the United States, even crossing barriers to other parts of the world, causing outrage and helplessness. So brace yourself because this video is intense. Baby Brianna lost her life so heartbreakingly that the mere account of the facts is not suitable for sensitive people. Therefore, discretion is recommended, or as I say, hold on tight to your chair, and if you're not sitting, sit down.
We have never shown images like these before, but investigators have shared them with us in the hope that people will realize how serious the problem of child abuse is and that it is everyone's responsibility to intervene and stop it. This is baby Brianna. She was beaten and abused. She has huge bruises on her head and her pinky fingers are lacerated. She had bite marks on her face.
Such was the impact of this heartbreaking event that changes in the law made us wait, giving rise to the creation of Brianna's Law, whose requirements point to life imprisonment as punishment for the abuse of the smallest ones, resulting in death in any person under 12 years old. Her mobilization caused more stir after years later, Brianna's mother managed to avoid serving her entire sentence thanks to her good behavior, thus being on parole. Did this woman deserve to see the light of day on the other side of the prison bars? Well, next I'm going to tell you all the details of such an act. Let's delve into the horrifying and distressing life this innocent little girl had to live. Brianna Lopez was born on February 14, 2002. Ironically, on the day when love was celebrated, unfortunately, love would be what she would never have. Her mother, Stephanie Renee Lopez, 22 years old, was not eagerly awaiting her, let alone intending to provide this new member with all the care a newborn needs. Food, hygiene, protection, affection, love. None of what comes from maternal instinct was in this woman's deoxyribonucleic acid. On the contrary, she lacked it completely. She resided in Las Cruces, New Mexico, with the girl's father named Andrew Walters and 2 other individuals, both relatives of the newborn, Robert Walters and Stephen Lopez. All being frequent users of illegal substances, the home was not exactly the ideal place to house a minor. Stephanie knew nothing more than this sordid, impure world steeped in illegal substances, alcohol, and absolute ruin among narcotics. She never wanted to become the mother of this monster, considering that taking care of another living being was a quite complicated task. However, when she found herself in the middle of this situation, far from changing her lifestyle or accepting her new role in motherhood, she simply chose to ignore the basic needs of her baby. In the house of terror, which apparently was limited to the small space of a trailer or one of those mobile homes, the girl's grandmother, Patricia Walters, also lived. Despite not having participated in the suffering, she chose to remain silent about the horrifying events she witnessed, just like the other individual, Robert. They said they didn't want to interfere in the lives of the heartless parents, but that decision ultimately makes them accomplices to the abuse. They are guilty, in my opinion. No one could believe how they could stay silent for so long considering the level of violence that was experienced, as if it was their own family.
They admitted that they threw her into the air and let her hit the ceiling and land on the floor, which is only half of what happened. They went to play video games in the room and suddenly started throwing her in the air as if she was a football. They admitted that she kept hitting the ceiling and falling to the floor.
No member of the family was suitable to take care of Brianna, much less her mother, which is why Andrew occasionally took the initiative to change diapers and give her an episode and give her a sporadic bath. The little attention they gave her was really to prevent her imminent premature death, never out of love or mercy. More than once, the same sadism took place with which the baby finally succumbed to death, being beaten, treated like a rag doll, shaken, mistreated, and worst of all, intimately abused by her father and her uncle Stephen. The day the little one could no longer bear it was July 19th, 2002, at just 5 months old. Finally, the violence against her had claimed her life, in fact being the most merciful thing she knew in this earthly plane. Death came as a mantle of salvation to shelter her, giving her that breath of peace she so needed, away from her abusers who were her own family. The beginning of the discovery of this fateful story started with a 911 call. The clock was striking 10 in the morning and a mother was facing her worst nightmare. Her baby had no vital signs. Stephanie called emergencies to report the discovery. However, her mode of communication did not announce the despair or anguish of a mother distressed by seeing her lifeless baby. On the contrary, apathy and disinterest about the subject could be heard. On the other side of the line, the operator realized the peculiar situation, although she did her best to make the woman follow her instructions. She told her step by step how to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation, although according to the data provided, the little girl had been motionless for a good amount of time. The truth was that there was no longer any maneuver capable of reviving her, much less with the little effort that Stephanie was making to save her daughter. It wasn't strange that she had only called 911 to somehow try to divert attention and make it seem like it was all an accident or a natural death. However, Brianna's little body harbored the story of her abuse, bore the marks of her suffering, and played the most important role when it came to collecting evidence. The whole truth was on her skin, and no family member could hide that from now on. An ambulance soon arrived to take her to the nearest hospital. Unfortunately, no one could do anything about it, only record the time of her death. What happened? That was the question from the doctors who attended to the little girl. There, her mother explained that hours before the baby had fallen off the bed, an explanation that was far from what could answer for the injuries on Brianna's body. The doctors took less than 5 minutes to realize that something was seriously wrong. So, under these circumstances, they decided to contact the authorities.
We received a call that a baby had died in the hospital, and it was suspected to be child abuse. So we found out practically as she was arriving at the hospital and she was attended to by the police officers. They were calling us detectives. The hospital doesn't notify us, the police do. But if they notify the police, there would be any sign of trauma or injury that doesn't make sense. Having bruises, and she only had bruises from head to toe. So they contacted the police and then the police called us. They did so while the detectives got there.
Once both police officers and detectives were notified, the girl's body was moved for the autopsy. Evidence of violence was expected to be found, but what could not be foreseen was the level of sadism and the amount of aggression she had suffered. They were facing one of the most horrific cases of child abuse ever seen in Mexico and the United States. The results shattered all the medical staff, the authorities, the entire world, except for these monsters, the victims' relatives, who obviously tried to pretend to be sad, but the sadness in their eyes could never be distinguished. The cause of death were cranial brain injuries, bruises, abrasions all over her skin and head, scratches and hematomas, some scars from previous blows and other fresh wounds, thus dictating the decadent life of Brianna, which she led during her scarce but very distressing 5 months of age. As if that were not enough, some fractures were added to these heartbreaking results, and the overwhelming evidence of intimate abuse by at least 2 men, both relatives of hers. It was determined that at least during the last 3 days she was alive, she suffered blunt injuries to the skull. Only she knew of the true ordeal of endless torture, which caused her so much pain as to cry and scream heartbreakingly. Unfortunately, Brianna's pleading lament for mercy only incited more violence to force her into silence. Around 15 human bites were detected on her skin, which are presumed to have been a form of punishment to make her stop crying. It was more than clear that the situation was the result of an accident. This little girl's life was a real hell from the day of her birth, and the family was immediately put under surveillance, being the main suspects of such a torturous crime.
On July 19, 2002, baby Brian died. What went through your mind the day you went to the hospital and saw her?
I have a lot to do.
Detective Lindale was the first officer on the scene. And when did you have time to sit down and look back?
I cried and it will stay with me for the rest of my life.
Investigators say that Brianne's mother, Stephanie Lopez, Uncle Esteban Lopez, and her father, Andrew Walters, were responsible.
Detectives and investigators had to face an extremely disturbing case. They had to take it into their own hands and delve into the minds of the perpetrators to get to the bottom of everything, question to the point of reconstructing the facts and having to bear the truth. It is said that more than one shed some tears after discovering the Machiavellian nature of the abuse and that the images of Brianna's body remained in their minds forever. However, it also sparked a new level of concern about the mistreatment of little ones, raising the question of whether children are truly safe at home. And on the other hand, local news outlets did not remain silent, joining in to raise awareness about this situation.
Brianna Lopez didn't reach 6 months.
Her death was one of the worst cases of child abuse in New Mexico, so severe that agents and police officers cried and the district attorney was left speechless. Are our children safe these days?
Unfortunately, not all cases of this nature are discovered in time, and even when they are, they often enter a long process of investigation by child services which, as in some other cases we have narrated that I have told you about, have a tragic end. And I tell you this because the name of baby Brianna never reached the child protection offices. Nobody except the tenants of the trailer knew the hell she was living, and as we now know, they were absolutely unwilling to interfere, so the little girl didn't have a single chance to survive. So, when the suspects were in custody, it was only a matter of time before they began to confess their heartbreaking acts, focusing first on Andrew Walters' version. He seemed to be narrating a horror movie, filled with pain and infamy against someone innocent. Just listening to him made you want to throw up. He said it all started on July 18, 2002, a day before the 911 call that reported the baby with no vital signs. The afternoon was progressing as usual. Andrew and Stephen Lopez were inside the mobile home with no other concern than to kill time as people without responsibilities like slackers. He also remembers having turned on the video game console and having shared a couple of hours with his daughter's uncle, both lost in the effects of the illegal pills they used to consume frequently, thus downplaying that the care of Brianna was under their control. They had no problem going shopping for a couple of beers, which, mixed with other types of substances, simply could not end well. Gradually, the lucidity of these subjects was on the floor. They were out of their minds, with their consciousness turned off, and in that inhospitable environment, the baby was in imminent danger, not only from the possibility of having an accident, but from the very insecure situation she was exposed to under the yoke of her father and uncle, lost in alcohol and substances. The truth is that at the beginning of the day, the little girl was not even considered as a human being. She remained behind a door that helped to mitigate her cries of desperation for food and a diaper change. Ironically, having stayed behind that locked door would have given her a minimal chance of life, or at least a chance to continue existing perhaps for some
more months.
Until the inevitable, materialized. After spending the whole day without a bite to eat on his father's mind, he finally came to the idea of his existence. Seemingly it was for her, to feed and clothe her. However, in the midst of all that activity, something happened in Andrew's head. Did he see her as an object? Did he hate her for existing? Who knows? Only in his twisted thoughts can the truth be found. Although the truth is that he completely minimized the fact that she was a human being or his own daughter, they, in the midst of irresponsible jargon, drunk and intoxicated, she was extremely weak, almost unconscious due to the child neglect from the previous days. This was the scenario that unleashed the worst suffering in history. What started as a supposed game with the baby turned into a roller coaster of jolts. They took Brianna as if she were
a ball,
and they threw her to the ceiling to see her bounce from the ceiling to the floor without any protection. She practically flew through the air, receiving the impact of the hardness of the trailer floors, of the walls, just like a rag doll. It is also said that when she opened up from the rough play, both proceeded to attack her intimately. Once the attack was over, the subjects went to sleep thinking that everything would be in order the next day. A few hours later, Andrew opened his eyes in the middle of an unbearable hangover, a raw one. He began to question everything that had happened that night, and it was then that he realized the sadism with which he had treated his daughter. Under the uncertainty of whether she was still alive or not, he got out of bed and headed towards where the lifeless baby lay. Presumably from this discovery, the call to emergencies was made in which the victim's mother showed total disinterest. Now, what role did this woman play in the murder of her daughter? You're asking, so here it is.
Without a doubt she was involved, that I can guarantee you.
And that was noticed even when they arrived at the hospital, because unintentionally she made a confession by saying out loud, "I'm very sorry," words heard by one of the nurses who were there at that moment. 1.
One of the nurses said they let Stephanie into the room so she could say goodbye to her. There was a large bruise from the top of the eye to the head. They had her lying on the table and she had a blanket, to cover her body. Stephanie walked in and covered her face with the blanket and then just said sorry, and one of the nurses heard her.
Stephanie Lopez didn't take long to tell her own version of the events. In front of the officers and investigators, she admitted to being present in the trailer while her partner and her brother were using substances. Unfortunately, she didn't have the sanity in her head to visualize the danger her little girl was in. She didn't even care. This heartless mother said she arrived at the trailer around 7 in the evening, a time when she usually showed up after finishing a day's work. Once there, she noticed the atmosphere of pills and alcohol and immediately decided to take the first sip of beer. She ingested a couple of pills and then her consciousness faded from her body. Where is the baby? It was a question that she didn't care about. She didn't give a damn. In fact, she merely asked, with little concern, that someone keep an eye on her. Yeah, there she is. But I don't give a damn. Immediately after, according to his story, he did nothing more than get ready to rest. And being July 19th of the year, 2002, her partner desperately tries to wake her up. He wants to tell her that the baby has no vital signs, but his concern is not focused on the fact that Brianna may never open her eyes again, but mainly he worries about the consequences this may bring. All these disturbing facts did not come to light until after a few hours of interrogation. The investigators knew that this trio of people, if we can call them people, had the entire responsibility for the little girl's death. But everyone was playing an innocent role, attributing the blows to a supposed bed accident. It was the pressure on them, on the other hand, exerted by the authorities, which finally managed to break them down, making Andrew be the first to confess. Unfortunately, Patricia and Robert Walters, who were witnesses to these brutal beatings, only proceeded to ignore the situation. As I was telling you at the beginning, it was nothing more than an ordinary day in the midst of a desolate family environment, contaminated by the brutal consequences of drug use and alcohol abuse. They took it for granted that the next day Brianna would wake up and survive. But this time it wasn't like that. It wasn't like all the other days. Unknowingly, they then became accomplices. The
people in this community will never forget Brianna, nor the detectives, social workers, or prosecutors who worked on her case. The detective says they never found pictures of Brianna in her house, not a single one of her playing, laughing, or smiling. He wanted to know what she looked like and what she looked like when she was alive. Before they started the autopsy, and her little face lay on a white sheet, and I thought she looked asleep, so I took a picture.
Dozens of stories like this began to circulate in the news. The fateful experience of having been part of this case was forever etched in their memories. However, particularly the story of this detective aroused much compassion, as upon realizing that the little girl had no photos in life, he decided to take one of her after she had passed away, then send it to be edited, remove the bruises from her little face, and leave it as a memory of her fleeting existence, referring to Brianna's face as a reminder that both he and his colleagues must stay alert to each and every one of the cases of abuse of the little ones.
That drives me to work harder to be the voice of every child who suffers from abuse.
It is also said that telling this story so graphically in public aimed to raise society's awareness about this issue. How many more children might be going through the same suffering right now as you're listening to me? Well, meanwhile, without setting aside the future behind bars for the perpetrators, once the day of judgment arrived, many more dark details came to light. For example, during a deoxyribonucleic acid test, it was determined that there were traces of blood in Andrew's underwear, giving full assurance that the intimate abuse did indeed take place, apparently while the baby was in her last breaths of life. The trial held in Albuquerque, New Mexico, left all attendees speechless. Even the prosecutor, Susana Martinez, had to swallow her emotions so they wouldn't burst from her eyes in the form of a lamentable cry after witnessing the evidence of such a beating, that is, the photographs of the little girl.
Marks of bruises and bites all over her body that were old and new. Fractures in the skull that were old and new. Bleeding in the brain that was both old and new, which meant that she had been physically abused all her life.
Completely shocked by all the abuses against the little 5-month-old girl, Martinez put everything into achieving the longest sentences against these 3 abusers. For his part, Andrew Walters had been formally accused of abusing the little ones, taking their life, and violence against a little one whose sentence added up to 57 years in prison. At the same time, his accomplice, Stephen Lopez, received the same charges as an accusation and for which he was put behind bars to serve the same sentence as the girl's father. At first, everything seemed to indicate that justice would be playing a significant role on the victim's side. However, in court, it could not be ignored that the mother of the deceased, Stephanie Lopez, did not actually participate in the attack directly. It was said that despite her well-known hatred for Brianna, her lack of maternal instinct, and her obvious disinterest in the child's well-being, she actually had nothing to do with the homicide, even though her own hands had mistreated her in the past. So the charges against her were reduced to negligence and child neglect, whose punishment totaled just 27 years behind bars. A real bargain. Until the day of the sentencing, at least there was the peace of mind that she would remain in prison for nearly 3 decades. No one could foresee that her desire for freedom would be much stronger than the love for her own daughter, and even than guilt, because the inmate maintained good behavior. In the following years, she was at the West New Mexico Correctional Center. She did it with the aim of someday being able to be released on parole for good behavior, something that she unfortunately managed to achieve in 2021 after serving less than half of her sentence.
In October, Stephanie Lopez will be on parole. Thousands of people have signed a petition asking the parole board to keep her behind bars. Members collected over 60,000 signatures asking to revoke the parole.
Even though the years had passed, the community kept their word that marked never forgetting baby Brianna. They united to prevent at all costs that this heartless mother could be released, a task that unfortunately was not achieved. For when they least realized it, Laura, the ex-convict, was breathing the fresh air on the other side of the bars that once reminded her of her sadistic silence for not doing anything to save her daughter. Us.
We met with the mother of little Brianna when she stopped at a gas station in Las Lunas, about an hour after being released from prison. Our helicopter was up high when Lopez left the jail. Lopez only served 13 years after initially being sentenced to 27.
So describing the situation as the result of a weak law, people got to work on what we previously discussed as the Brianna Law. And now, coming to the end of this sad tale, I ask you again what I asked at the beginning. Does this woman deserve to have been released after what she did? Remember, she didn't directly kill him. I think those 27 years, or well, he didn't even reach 27, were ridiculous. But you leave it to me. In the comments, remember that on this channel there are videos Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday. And if you want me to make any special topic, you can leave it here below in the comments.
Thank you.